For the 2+ years that I've been playing Clash Royale, I think one of the most interesting and one of my favorite archetypes that I've seen has got to be bridge spam. Now, it didn't come at the very beginning of the game, it kind of came later. I think it was a Vietnam tournament where it was really kind of coined, if I'm not mistaken. And it's an archetype that was spawned mostly with like the introduction of the Bandit and the Battle Ram, particularly. So it's one of those archetypes that does, good or poorly depending on the current meta, but right now it's really strong. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at this Musketeer Lumberjack bridge spammer. So what's cracking, everybody? You're back with Mr. Berger, and as I mentioned, this bridge spam deck incorporates the recently buffed Musketeer. It's a card that has kind of been a staple, range support card. They can easily fit into a lot of different decks, but it doesn't really shine compared to other alternatives now, because now you got the powerful wizard since that recent buff. I guess it wasn't too recent, but since that last buff. And then you've got, the E-Wiz, and you've got, archers. There's just a lot of alternatives to it. But since that recent buff, she's been all over the place. So I found this bridge spam deck with her, and I decided to give it a run in the global tournament. And I really like bridge spam in general, as I mentioned there in the intro. And, I also really like the Lumberjack. He's quickly becoming one of my favorite cards, if not my favorite. As you can see at the top there, the Knight used to be my favorite. That's why I've always had, my face on his body there as kind of a joke. But, I don't know, he's kind of fallen out of fashion. He used to be way stronger when over-leveled, and he's been, at the, the tough end of the balance changes lately. Although, the last 2 patches he has gotten a little bit of his initial power back. But anyway, the Lumberjack plays a similar role as kind of that mini-tank, but he's also very fast and aggressive and has that rage effect, and that works out really great in this deck. So, this deck, it's pretty similar to another bridge spam deck that I recently covered, but it depends on when I release the videos. Maybe I'll release this one first. But anyway, the other one includes an elixir pump, and I'm not too big of a fan of a pump. I'm just not the kind of person that likes playing with it. That one has a lot more of a spell bait element, and this one is a little bit more straightforward, just, be aggressive, and you basically just replace that hunter, which was kind of the other bridge spam range support kind of card, with the Musketeer. So it just kind of incorporated the Musketeer into a pretty traditional bridge spam deck. Now, I used this deck in the global tournament, in the most recent one, and I actually managed to get 13 wins with it, which is pretty good for someone like me. I'm used to getting not that many. But to be fair, the global tournaments are a little bit easier. I have gotten, I think, 11 wins in the classic. I'm still yet to get my 12 wins. So again, not that great of a player, but in the global tournaments, 13 wins, that's enough to get all the bonus rewards if I wanted to unlock it. So it's pretty decent, considering that I was able to do that, being that I'm somebody of my skill level. So this deck is very viable, pretty good if you're wanting to use it in the global tournament or in challenges right now, or if you have the card levels, you could definitely play it on ladder as well. So that was actually my 13th win in that last replay. We're going to be kind of working our way backwards here. This would be win number 12. So guys, naturally, as a bridge spam deck, this deck is very aggressive. Now, that doesn't mean that you can consistently place everything at the bridge and expect to win the game. It's not that simple. You do need to play defense. You do need to get those positive elixir trades, try to get good value with your cards, and then you can afford to be aggressive once you've got some of them built up, generally on defense, and they're going in for a counter push. You can support them with those aggressive cards like the Bandit, the Battle Ram, the Lumberjack, all those things. So, it is an aggressive deck. Play defensive at first and go for a counter push, but in double elixir you can definitely afford to be a little bit more aggressive. And it's just the way that the deck is built, because it's got all these really fast cards with high DPS. You got the Bandit that can dash in really quickly, the Lumberjack who can run in and get the rage effect. You got a Barb Barrel to clear the way initially. They do a fight very well at the bridge or even on your opponent's territory. So once you've gained a little bit of an elixir advantage, your opponent might be desperately putting things down, like putting down the E-Wiz for the enter the arena effect, but then maybe the E-Wiz will just get instantly chopped up by the Lumberjack. Or maybe they'll put a wizard further away to try to cleave all of your stuff, but then the Bandit just jumps in, dashes in, and obliterates that wizard. So definitely a very aggressive deck for good reason, but don't be super aggressive all the time. Don't just willy-nilly place everything at the bridge whenever you think would be a good time. unless you've established that, elixir advantage, unless you've played, defense and you've got something remaining on defense that you can support with a counter push, not investing too much elixir that you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. Because it does have some defensive potential, but it's not really like a control deck, it's a little bit more aggressive. So, you don't want to be like waiting to play defense the entire game and trying to counter their big massive golem push. You can't afford to like counter push in the opposite lane, for example, if they're going for a big beatdown push. So think of it as definitely a bridge spam deck, a little bit of element of defense, but not as much as like a control deck where you're really trying to control the battlefield and then go in for that opportune time. That one big push. This one is more like seeking out, okay, when can I afford to go in for a counter push? When can I afford to go aggressive in the opposite lane if they've, put down a big golem or a lava hound or something like that. So anyway, let's talk about all the bridge spam cards in here. A lot of classic bridge spam cards, as I mentioned. You have the Battle Ram and you have the Bandit. Those are two that are very core in pretty much any bridge spam deck. You've also got the Minions. For some reason, Minions I feel like fit into a lot of bridge spam decks. I don't know why particularly that they're that great in bridge spam, but there's something to attack air. They're pretty cheap, so they're just a good card all around. They fit into a lot of different decks, so they actually work out pretty decently in this particular one as well. The Ice Spirit, it's another card that is pretty core in most bridge spam decks. It's definitely replaceable. To me, Ice Spirit is very much a flux card. If you're really going for a cycle deck, like a really fast, like 2.6 Hog Cycle, you've pretty much got to have the Ice Spirit in there. But if you're like, okay, what can I switch out for something else? Generally, the Ice Spirit's going to be the one to go. Like in bait decks, for example, if you're going to take the classic log bait deck and you're going to try to put like the Dark Goblin in there, generally the card that you would take out would be that Ice Spirit. But he fits really well into bridge spam decks. Mostly because it gives you the potential for positive elixir trades. He only costs 1 elixir, and he can do things like, counter minions or minion hordes, with minimal damage, combined with another cheap card, of course, for the minion horde. But in the case of something, like minions or even like a Musketeer or an E-Wiz, he can shut it down pretty well. Maybe it'll get like 1 swing off on your tower, but for only 1 elixir, he does a pretty good job. And he also supports your aggressive cards as well. He, when you put him down in front of like your Battle Ram, for example, he'll do like kind of that mini tank roll, tank for it for a little bit from the Princess Tower, and then if your opponent puts anything down to counter that Battle Ram, he might jump on it, and even just that, like, what is it? It's only like a half a second freeze now or something like that. It's enough to buy your Battle Ram some time. Even like if they send in like a stun unit, like an E-Drag, it might jump onto that E-Drag and freeze it so that it doesn't stun your Battle Ram, and then your Battle Ram can connect to the opponent's tower. Works out great in combination with, the other aggressive cards like the Lumberjack and like the Bandit as well. Now let's talk about that Lumberjack. Lumberjack is huge in this deck. I mentioned him earlier. I really like him. Really great card all around. And he traditionally like would only really fit into like golem decks. And I feel like I've been seeing him more and more. Maybe not in this particular meta, but he does work out in this deck. Since he got that buff a few patches ago, he's been pretty viable. Mini P.E.K.K.A. isn't super popular, but hits like a truck. Lumberjack is the same thing. It's not super popular. It doesn't hit as heavy, but it's got really high DPS, with his massive attack speed. He has that huge DPS output. He has the rage effect. It just works out great in this deck. As I mentioned, he's probably my favorite card right now, if not one of my favorites then for sure. He fits into this deck perfectly. Now, let's talk specifically why he fits into this deck so well. Well, first of all, 3 major things, right? First of all, he's really fast, and when I'm talking about fast, I'm talking about move speed. Now, he runs really quickly, and that's, in essence what a bridge spam deck is you're wanting to apply pressure onto your opponent, get units in there very quickly, so that your opponent either doesn't have time to react, or doesn't react properly because you're putting on the pressure too aggressively, and so then they, slip up and make a mistake. So that Lumberjack really fits in there because he runs in so quickly, and then he does this massive damage. Your opponent absolutely has to answer him or they're really going to pay for it. So on top of that massive move speed that he also has really high attack speed and high DPS, so high damage output. DPS, of course, if you're not familiar with the term, is damage per second, and it just works out really well. Again, with the increased or the massive move speed, he attacks really quickly. so that just adds to that overall threat that he provides for your opponent. And you know, the fact that they have to react to him or he'll do so much damage can really pay off, because it can cause them to panic and give you that elixir advantage. And then he's got that rage effect, so even if they do answer him properly, he drops that rage effect, and it's huge for this deck. It allows your battle ram to connect even faster, and the raged battle ram charges in so quick. It's really fun to watch. You know, it makes your bandit attack really quickly. It makes your musketeer do a bunch of damage, and the minions too. If you can get the minions raged, those things do a ton of damage. If they're alive still and they connect to the tower and they're raged, they'll take out that tower so fast. So that rage effect, that really fast move speed, the high damage output, you know, high attack speed, high DPS, just works out really well in this deck. So that's why that Lumberjack is really great in this deck. Now what about the Musketeer? As I mentioned, she's kind of worked her way into a lot of different decks. She isn't too popular, or wasn't too popular up until this recent buff. And I don't know, I feel like cards that get buffed, generally people start to use them a bit more. I don't know if she's really going to be super viable in a lot of decks for a long time again, but I'm not sure if that's the case, or if maybe people are just kind of infatuated with her a little bit because of that recent buff. But either way, she works out really well in this deck. You know, it's been great, it's been fun to play with her. I do like the card, pretty simple and straightforward. A lot of these bridge spam decks run the Hunter, but I feel like the Musketeer now has kind of taken that role. Hunter's a very niche card, and the bridge spam decks seem to be one of the ones that really incorporated him and did a pretty good job of it. But the Musketeer is more of a ranged card, not really a tank killer, more of a ranged support. I know the the Hunter kind of plays that role as well, but he's a little bit more complex, and he can do that massive damage, you know, up close to units and things like that. So the Musketeer works out great. If you're cycling her in the back, you don't have a lot of spell bait cards in this deck, so be careful that they don't, you know, just fireball or poison or anything like that, and just, you know, take out your Musketeer and then also do damage to your tower. Just be a little bit conscious of that. Use her as more of a defensive card, and then when she's survived, she can be that ranged support card to support your aggressive push with like the Bandit or the Battle Ram or the Lumberjack or all of the above, right? Alright guys, next we will talk about the two spells. So the Fireball, why do we choose the Fireball over Poison or anything else in this deck? Well, first of all, over Poison as a mid-range spell, it's because it has that instantaneous damage, which can be very beneficial in the overall spirit of bridge spam decks. Don't get me wrong, if you prefer the Poison, you can totally run it. It's very viable in this kind of deck, but just in that spirit of, you know, doing a bunch of aggressive damage, sending in the Fireball paired with like maybe a Barbarian Barrel, or excuse me, not a barrel, but rather a Battering Ram. I called it a Battering Ram. Well, that's what it is, right? A Battle Ram. You know, it can work out great because they'll put down something to counter your Battle Ram, and then you got the Predictive Fireball in there. If it connects properly, or if you know they're going to put it down and it connects, then it can be great. So I wouldn't really recommend a heavy spell just because it makes it a higher elixir cost. You don't want to have to wait for that rocket. But if you are like a rocket or lightning kind of guy or gal, then go ahead and put that in there. What about the Barbarian Barrel? It's great for a lot of things. It works out really well in this deck. It's just a good card all around. If you prefer like Zap or Log, that's totally fine too. But the Barb Barrel, I really like it in the current meta. You know, as I mentioned in previous videos, it wasn't that great on release, and it got buffed and it got buffed and it got buffed a bunch of times. And they reduced the elixir cost only down to 2. And now it seems like it's a really viable card. But then they nerfed it like twice. But it's still really viable. The win rates and the usage rates are really high right now still. So I would recommend using that card in there. It does a lot of different things. It counters swarm units for one. So it can take out a whole goblin gang, goblin barrel if you're going up against a bait. It can take out a skeleton army. You know, obviously spear goblins and regular goblins and skeletons as well. It counters mid-range support cards surprisingly well. If you just use a single 2 elixir Barbarian Barrel on like a Musketeer, for example, or even like a Wizard or an E-Wiz, it'll pretty much take that thing out, assuming that that thing is alone and that you use it once it's crossed the bridge and it's on your territory. So then you got the Princess Tower support. But regardless, that's only a 2 elixir cost card. It's taking out potentially like a 4 or 5 elixir cost card. So it has that potential for positive elixir trades, big ones, with that defensive role against those mid-range support cards. Now, if they do put something in front of their support card, like some sort of tank or a hog or a ram, it might not work out as well. But regardless, that roll damage still does a lot. Like, look how much it did to the magic archer there, and then the barbarian actually goes and finishes off the magic archer, even though the princess tower, my opponent's princess tower, is chipping away at that barbarian the whole time. So it works out really good, works out really well against those mid-range support cards. It can also just be used generally as a mini tank. If you don't have anything else, and your opponent's sending in, like, I don't know, a prince or a lumberjack, and that's all you got in hand, as far as like ground units go, or melee units go, then it works out. Actually, you can use that barbarian just by himself, just to you need that warm body, kind of something to distract your opponent's units, and it works out. So one of the many roles that he can do. He doesn't have as long range as the log, so he's not as reliable for supporting the ram or the bandit or anything like that. But if you prefer the log, go ahead. But I don't know, I just feel like he's a good card in this particular deck in this current meta. But by all means, go with whichever one you prefer. I think that all the different spells, all the different light spells, are pretty viewable in bridge spam decks, at least right now. But the Barbarian Barrel is just where it's at as far as overall, strength and popularity and utility and usage rates go. Now, I talked about the Ice Spirit already, but I'm just going to reiterate really quickly. He's great for positive elixir trades. He's also just a good, cheap support card to go in with a push. If you've got like a Musketeer still alive, or maybe even like a Lumberjack or a Bandit, just one extra elixir to send in for a counter push to provide a little bit of support, a little bit of extra damage, something to stun whatever your opponent's counter might be, or to take out any, maybe they'll put down skeletons to soak up the bandit's charge, but then the Ice Spirit leaps on the skeletons and takes them out before your bandit gets distracted by them, for example, right? So he works out great in this deck as well. Those minions, I'm not so sure why they're so popular in bridge spam decks, but they work out pretty well. They're just relatively speedy versus like the Mega Minion, for example. That's another card that fits a similar role, only costs 3 elixir. It's a ranged card, it's got pretty close range, or an air card, excuse me, that's got pretty close range. And it has a higher health pool, but it's a little bit slower, the Mega Minion is. Anyway, my point being that they're interchangeable in a lot of decks. Excuse me. This one particularly runs the minions. I think most bridge spam decks do. Probably mostly because they're a little bit faster. They can also benefit really well from that rage effect. So if you've got the Lumberjack rage effect, well, first of all, look at it right there with the Battle Ram charging in. Didn't quite connect, but you can see the speed of the Battle Ram rage. The minions, as I mentioned earlier too, they get raged. They do a whole ton of damage. So they can support your aggressive cards really well to take out any counters. If they connect to the opponent's tower, they'll obliterate it if they're raged. So it works out great. They're just generally a reliable card for multiple roles. They're usually like a cheap defense. So generally you're not going to be like using them at the bridge aggressively. Like, that's rarely going to pay off. Your opponent will just use an Ice Spirit or something to counter them or zap them, and they'll be dead, and then it's a positive trade for your opponent. So generally you're going to be using them to take out, like this Ewiz, for example. I might use them there. In this case I can just use the Ice Spirit, and that's even better. But you can use them to take out, ranged support units behind your opponent's tank or behind your opponent's Hog Rider or something like that. And so on top of that, let's see. They're just a cheap defensive card. I mean, they even chip away at like tanks and stuff like that too. Like, they've just got high damage output. I really like Bats, similar role, but Bats can just be zapped right out of the sky anytime. So if you don't have any other zap bait cards, which I don't think you really do in this deck, they wouldn't be that great. So minions are just kind of that mid-range support card, and on top of this, they're also air. They're the only air unit in the deck, so do take advantage of that. If your opponent is sending in something slow, like let's say a knight or whatever, just for example, and you don't want it to connect to your tower, you can use the minions on top of it, and they won't take any damage from that knight because of their air units. And then they'll, of course, provide that potential counter push threat. Alright guys, let's do opening moves and card replacements, and then maybe run through a replay or two, and then we'll wrap it on up here, call it a video. So let's see, for opening moves, it is a bridge spam deck. So if you want to open with like a Bandit or a Battle Ram at the bridge, you can. I wouldn't really do the Battle Ram because it's a bigger investment, and it's just a little bit easier to counter. The Bandit, she can do some damage. She can charge in, take out your opponent's whatever their counter is, or connect to the tower and do a bunch of damage. You could Barb Barrel even at the bridge if you wanted to, if you didn't have any other option, or just like Ice Spirit at the bridge or in the back. There's a lot of different people that will tell you different things about cycling Bandit in the back versus cycling her at the bridge. In the spirit of the bridge spam deck, you could use her at the bridge, but honestly, personally, I prefer to cycle things in the back, and she provides that defensive role, and she will, you know, preemptively counter whatever your opponent might be putting down that lane that she's then going down. Minions are another pretty safe card to cycle. You could do the Musketeer, but again, when you do the Musketeer in the back, I'm probably guilty of this, I know I've done it in a few of these replays, you risk them using their Fireball or their Poison or their Rocket or whatever on your Musketeer and the tower as well. Lumberjack, not necessarily the best opener because he's so speedy. He doesn't do that, you know, consistent defensive role, essentially. He doesn't provide you that, you know, he only provides you a few seconds of defense down the one lane, and then he just runs into his death because he's really easy to counter by himself. Whereas the Bandit, she runs a little bit slower on her own. Minions are a little bit slower. All these cards are also cheaper. The Lumberjack's 4 elixir investment, so I wouldn't recommend opening with him. Unless your opponent is the opener and you're responding, then he can be a great defensive card, and that's generally how he's used. You use him on defense first, and then you use him, you know, as a very deadly counter push, and then when he dies, he drops that rage effect. And again, you can use him aggressively at the bridge as well, but he has that huge damage output potential and kind of low HP, so he's more of a defensive card in theory that then provides that massive offensive threat. So that's pretty much it for opening moves. You guys know me, I don't like waiting for my opponent to make the opener. I like making the opener and getting the game going and not leaking elixir. But if you are the kind of person that is comfortable with waiting for your opponent to make the first move, then that's completely fine. Wait to see what they do and then answer accordingly. Alright guys, for card replacements. So, Ice Spirit is really replaceable. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different bridge spam cards. You know, like some run Royal Ghost, just anything aggressive like that. If you prefer like skeletons or fire spirits, I'm sure that would work out great in there as well. It's just to have a kind of a cheap cycle card. So if you're looking at different bridge spam cards, you know, on Royale API or something like that, and you're thinking, okay, what am I going to sub out for this? Maybe you want to go like with the pump version, or maybe you want to put the hunter in there too. You could switch out the Ice Spirit. For the minions I mentioned, you could do like a Mega Minion or something like that. Just kind of another card that is relatively cheap, can play defense and a little bit of offensive threat. If you want to go bats, just make sure that you have some other Zap Bait cards in there. But generally you could just run minions or Mega Minion. You do want something that attacks air for the minions, so you know, keep that in mind when you're thinking of a replacement. For the Fireball, as I mentioned, you could always just go Poison. If you want to go heavy, you could go Rocket or Lightning, but I wouldn't recommend that in the bridge spam deck. I also wouldn't do 2 light spells. You do want to have at least 1 medium spell, I think. So I would recommend probably Poison if you're going to replace it with anything. And Poison is pretty viable in bridge spam decks. It clears out the way for like your Battle Ram, for example. You know, it's like 8 seconds or whatever of poison time. So it has like 8 seconds of protection essentially for your Battle Ram, where your opponent can't put down a Goblin Gang or a Skeleton Army or anything like that, or it'll just be basically instantly killed in the case of the Skeleton Army, or almost instantly killed in the case of the Gang. What else do we have here? For the Musketeer, as I mentioned, you could totally do Hunter. I think that a lot of these decks, I think I covered one very similar to this recently, or not too long ago, that just basically was the same but ran Hunter in the place of Musketeer. So Musketeer is just in there because of that recent buff. If you're going to replace her, just get any of those ranged support cards, you know, Wizard, E-Wiz, Ice Wiz. If you're going to do, I don't know, Ice Wiz Tornado wouldn't really work in this deck. But if you wanted to be really weird with it, go ahead, be my guest, do Ice Wiz Tornado. But just kind of that mid-range, you know, 3, 4, 5 elixir cost support card. Archers would be another alternative for the Musketeer if you wanted to. For the Battle Ram, if you want to run Ram Rider, she's totally a legitimate replacement for pretty much any deck that runs Battle Ram. You could put the Ram Rider in for the Battle Ram. A little bit of different usage. I think that people are sleeping on her, honestly. I think that she's a great card and she has huge potential. And I've seen her pull off some really cool stuff. And she fits that Battle Ram role really similarly, really well. But I think people are just kind of still getting the hang of her and haven't quite figured out her true potential. So if you want to try her, go right ahead in the place of that Battle Ram, the Ram Rider there. And if you don't have that card, or you don't want to do either of those, you can always just run the classic Hog Rider. You know, it plays a similar role to the Battle Ram, goes straight for towers. If you were going to do like a Prince or a Dark Prince, you could potentially do that, but then you don't have anything that goes directly for towers, and you do kind of want a classic win condition in this, like a really hard win condition. because the Lumberjack and the Bandit and all of those, they can do a lot of damage to the tower, but they aren't as reliable as like the Battle Ram for going straight for the tower, because they'll get distracted by everything else, whereas the Battle Ram, the Hog Rider, the Ram Rider, they just go straight for that tower. For the Barbarian Barrel, you could probably just go for another light spell, honestly. As I mentioned, you could run Log. If you like Zap like me, I've been running Zap forever, excuse me. I haven't maxed out, so on ladder I definitely run Zap a lot. But in the challenges, it's a matter of preference. Barbarian Barrel, as I mentioned, is just good in this deck and good in the current meta. But if you don't like it and you prefer an alternative, just go for another light spell, any of the 2-cost spells, or even arrows if you wanted to. But if you're comfortable with the Barb Barrel, I would definitely recommend giving it a roll, because it's a great card right now. For the Bandit, kind of hard to replace, but it depends on what role you're going for. She could potentially be like be replaced by a mini tank, like a knight or an ice golem. You don't have an ice golem in this deck, and I think it would work out pretty well. But you could also go for something more aggressive, like a prince, something that's got that charge effect. But in theory, you do want something that runs really quickly, something that's got some sort of a charge or dash effect. I wouldn't recommend Mega Knight in this deck. That would really change it up. So maybe your prince would be my go-to replacement for Bandit, or just some sort of a mini tank, as I mentioned, like a knight or a Valkyrie or an ice golem. And for the Lumberjack, go-to replacement for the Lumberjack is always going to be Mini P.E.K.K.A, because it also costs 4 elixir and has that huge damage output. It's not going to work out as well in this deck because it's not as speedy and aggressive, but if you do want to run Mini P.E.K.K.A, go right ahead. If you're going to do any other replacement for the Lumberjack, probably just something really heavy hitting. If you wanted to keep that Hunter in there and have it on top of the Musketeer and have an element of spell bait, then that would be a good card to replace with it as well, because the Hunter hits really hard when it's close up. Alright guys, that is pretty much it for opening moves and card replacements. So let's run through this replay here, and you can see that I was able to, as soon as he put that pump down, I was able to just aggressively push in the opposite lane, and he tried to defend with the tornado but did not quite succeed, and I think I said in the Barbarian Barrel, yeah, to just finish off the job there. And that is the beauty of this bridge spam deck. Now, you might go against an opponent that knows how to counter it really well, but that guy, put the pump down, put the golem down, and I was able to go full force in the opposite lane. Make sure to let me know what you guys think of this deck in the comments below, and leave the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, because that really helps my channel to grow. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about this deck. I really like bridge spam, but maybe you aren't as big of a fan of it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, guys, and have a good night.